A continuación daremos inicio a la conferencia Liderazgo para la mejora en las escuelas. Para ello tenemos ya en el estrado a la señora Joni Hear, quien es instructora y asesora de la facultad de Educación en la Universidad Ontario Institute of Technology. Joni facilita la educación presencial y virtual para los módulos de liderazgo escolar internacional, incluyendo características de escuelas y sistemas efectivos, y recientemente ha impartido el programa en Dinamarca y Brasil. Ha trabajado como especialista senior en la rama de desarrollo de liderazgo del Ministerio de Educación en Ontario. Recibamos con fuertes palmas a Joni Hear.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to join me today. It's my honor to have the opportunity to speak to you today about leadership and innovation. This morning we have had a number of excellent speakers, and starting with the minister. The minister spoke about a number of things this morning that I hope to explore further with you over the next hour and a bit. He spoke about the role that everyone plays in terms of change and improving student achievement and well-being for all of our students. He spoke about the important leadership of the principal, and that was also reinforced by our expert panel that we had just prior to the break. He talked about the importance of the role of the teacher, and you as teachers, the important role you have in leading change. He talked about competencies. He spoke about the importance of a student focus, all towards increased student achievement and well-being. And over this next few hour or so, I hope to share more information about that with you. I will be drawing on research from Ontario, which is where I am from. I will also be drawing on some research from Hong Kong, as well as Vivienne Robinson's work from the University of Auckland. In our presentation this morning, Joanne and Amy spoke about systemness. And over the next hour, we're going to do a little bit of a shift because we're going to talk about you as the leader. I want you to just take a step back and really spend the next hour exploring your role as a leader and those skills and competencies that will enable you to lead change. This morning, your minister gave you an action, a call for action around changing and moving forward for high achievement for all students in Peru. And we know that change happens one person at a time. And in order for that to happen, each of us has to take a look at our own actions, our own responsibilities, and how we in fact can inform that change. So over the next hour, we're going to take a look at the leader in you. We will take a look at the leadership framework and further explore the framework that Joanne and Amy shared with you this morning. We'll talk a little bit about leadership practices and what is it that you can do as a leader, whether you are an aspiring teacher, a teacher leader, a school leader, or a system leader, to in fact begin that process. We'll take a look at the domains of change and the domains of leadership, and the framework that was so small in your handout. We're going to take a look at that on the screen today, so you'll have a chance to actually further explore that information. We'll also take a look at the work of Vivienne Robinson, and she identifies capabilities and as well as dimensions of leadership that in fact have informed and been successful in change moving forward. I have provided in your package an organizer, and it should look something like this. I'll give you just a minute to take that out. And I want to tell you a little bit about why I included that organizer. Brain theory tells us that what is so important when we are learning is not so much the learning, but the thinking about the learning. The metacognition is really where we internalize the information, and it actually helps us to begin our process in enacting it. So this organizer identifies some of those key concepts that we will be addressing over the next hour. And feel free to note on the organizer, you may have another way that works best for you. But I did want to share that with you because the brain research talks very, very clearly about how important that is to be able to give our learners a focus and a guide to guide their learning. If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, then you are a leader. So everyone in this room is a leader. As Joanne and Amy talked about earlier, it is not just about position. It is about the actions that you take. It's what you say, it's what you do, and we know from the research that there are a foundational set of skills that effective leaders worldwide demonstrate that in fact helps them to lead. I'd like you to think about a leader that you have worked with. And I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about two characteristics of that leader. So when I think about a fine leader that I worked for as a very beginning teacher, and the two things that I admired about him as a leader was, first of all, he developed relationships that inspired me to trust him. I trust that he was leading me in a path that was going to help students. He also had a wonderful saying that at the time I attributed to him, but as I became older and wiser, I realized that really it was another person's quote. But he would talk about he was going to show the way, pave the way, and get out of the way. And those were always inspiring words, because he certainly did that. So just take a minute, and with someone beside you, I'd like you just to share your two qualities that you identified when you thought about that leader. And I'll invite you back in about 30 seconds. Share. And may I invite you back, please? Thank you. Dr. Ken Leithwood, who is one of our researchers in Ontario, but certainly is known worldwide, identified this quote when he talked about leadership. He talked about leadership is the exercise of influence on organizational members and diverse stakeholders towards the identification and achievement of the organization's vision and goals. As you read this quote, there are key words I'd like you to just pay attention to. It is the exercise of influence. It is not just about authority. It's about influence. It's about all the organizational members. It is about your staff. It is about your colleagues. It is about your students. It is about your families. It is about your government. It is about all of your stakeholders. It's about your institutions of higher learning, such as our university here. And it's about the achievement of the goals and visions of the organization. As Joanne and Amy mentioned earlier, we had 3 priorities in Ontario. So it was important that we were all working towards those 3 goals. So the Ontario story is interesting. As Joanne clearly shared earlier, 14 years ago, we were in a situation, in a state, that we had much to learn and much to change. And if I think back to 15 years ago as a principal in the school, if I was to walk into those schools, what would I see? Well, I would see teachers working in isolation. I would see doors closed in classrooms. Sometimes if there was windows in the classroom door, I'd even see paper over those windows. Okay? Doors were closed, people worked in isolation. The focus was on teaching. And of course, we need to focus on teaching, but we also need to focus on learning. And that was a change. Now teachers work together, they plan together, they assess together, they teach together, and it is about the student learning. Many years ago, when we taught students, and I will say this very early in my career, when we taught students, we felt that they needed to learn what we had heard. And sometimes when they didn't, our tendency was to teach it more slowly, to perhaps teach it again, maybe even teach it louder. But we now know that we must teach it differently, because it is our responsibility to ensure that all of our students are learning. Decisions were made subjectively. One of the other changes that has occurred in Ontario is the use of data. We are much more data rich. We were also much smarter about data. It's an area that we continue to learn, but we now make decisions based on research. And Joanne gave that great analogy about following the shiny cars, and we no longer do that. We take a look at what does the research tell us will in fact make a difference. We had inequity in student achievement. Not all of our students were given the same opportunities to learn. And now we do much better at that. We still have groups of students that are not achieving at the level in which we would like them to, but we have moved a great distance around having multiple opportunities for all students to learn, whether they be auditory learners or visual learners, whether they live in an affluent neighborhood or whether they live in an area with poverty. And as Joanne mentioned, we have limited goals. So when we take a look over the next hour, we're going to take a look at leadership practices that as leaders we know will make a difference. And we're going to start with the self. So the beginning of my circle is the self. We then will move from there to school and then community. The Ontario Leadership Framework is a resource that is built on robust research. It is from research across the world. Dr. Ken Leafwood was one of the key authors of the document, and it really identifies those practices that in fact make a difference. And the slide that you were looking at this morning is the summary of that actual framework. We know that this particular framework is just one example. There are many frameworks across the world. The Australian Principals Association has a framework. The Norway Principals Association has a framework. But what is interesting is that when you look at all the frameworks, there are key foundational practices that are in all of them. They may be expressed differently, but they are the same. And which brings me to the discussion around contingent leadership. Because when we take a look at these frameworks or the research, what is so important is to be able to take that information and to put it in the context in which you work. Whether you work in a rural setting, in a country setting, whether you're working in a big city setting, but to take that information and apply it to your context, considering both the people that you're working with and the setting in which you work. Excuse me. It's also important to consider both direct and indirect leadership. Throughout my career, I worked in a small setting where my leadership was quite direct. I had personal interactions with almost everyone on staff on a daily basis. It was a smaller staff. I knew the families were in and out of the school, and so I had a very direct leadership influence. As I moved into roles where I was working with many schools and larger numbers, my leadership became more indirect in that I built around me a team that was going to help to deliver on those skills. And I was working with them and building their capacity to help support people. You may also experience this if you work in a small school or a very large high school, indirect and direct. When we talk about leadership practices, the conversation also emerges about leadership competencies. And you heard a bit about leadership competencies this morning. Those traits that people have that enable them to enact leadership. The document that I'm going to share with you and speak about is about practices. It is about those specific actions that leaders may have as part of their repertoire, and they are also actions that can be learned. And that's what makes it very powerful. Because one of the actions we will be doing over the next little bit will be reflecting on your own sense of where you stand within these skills, and to know that you can in fact enrich and enhance those skills. There are 5 domains of practice: setting goals, building relationships and developing people, developing the organization to support desired practices, improving the instructional program, and securing accountability. And I'd like to spend a few minutes around each of those. The first one is setting goals, and I always like to select a quote to sort of start a conversation. And this particular quote is by John Maxwell. You may have read some of his books on leadership. He talks about a leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. Here I'd given that quote credit to my former principal for years and years, only to realize that it was actually John Maxwell's work, as he had called. When we talk about setting goals, there are 4 key components or leadership practices that need to be considered and enacted upon. And many of these you have heard some of those already today, so I just want to summarize those, and certainly the detail of the framework is available on the website that we can provide to you, that if you wanted to look at it more clearly. It's about shared vision. It's about a vision that is clearly stated. It is a vision that is about improving student achievement and well-being. It is a vision that is clearly communicated. Communicated in words, communicated in actions, communicated on all communication that goes home, but just that clear vision. And what is really important to keep in mind, and it ties into the minister's message this morning, is that one of the activities that I did with my team as a principal was we had our mission and our vision. We knew where we were headed. And I always asked them to think about how did their role and how was their role and their actions going to help us to get there. And it didn't matter whether I was speaking to my teachers or my assistants or my people who took care of the facility or my people who worked with lunchroom. I wanted everyone to understand their role and how they contributed to perhaps the conditions that were going to enable us to achieve those goals. It was about high expectations for all staff and for all students. Not just some of our students, but all of our students. And it was about communicating that information to all of the stakeholders on a regular basis. The second component is building relationships and developing people. And we've heard a lot about how important people are in terms of moving forward in change. The key to its successful leadership today is influence, not authority. The quote by Ken Blanchard. When we think about building relationships and developing people, there are 3 components, 3 components to think about. We know that people learn when they can move out of their comfort zone. We all have a zone in which we're quite comfortable. We feel confident, we feel comfortable, we feel confident, and we have credibility in that zone. But we know in order to learn, we have to step out of that comfort zone. And when we talk about change, and we talk about moving forward and improvement, we know that that involves some unlearning and some learning. So as a teacher or a member of a team, that is about to embark on learning, it is so important that I have trust in my leader and that my leader has in fact created a safe environment in which I can learn. Because when we learn, we need to take risks, and sometimes we're going to fail. We won't always get it the first time. But we need to feel safe to be able to take that risk, to try something, to try it again, without fear of reprisal, but rather of encouragement. And that's so important as a classroom teacher. We do that with our students. It's so important as a leader, whether you are leading a team within your school, whether you're a school or a system leader, to create that environment where people are willing to take the risk, because that's really when learning takes place. That builds the professional capacities of staff. One of the ways to create that environment is needing to know about your staff and the people that you work with. It's about understanding how their personal life impacts their professional life. And I always found that as I got to know my staff, and I asked about their families, and I asked about their children, and I made sure that I knew about that. That care and consideration, I always felt helped to create that environment that they felt safe. As I asked, I also shared what I was willing to share about my family too. So it really was about building that relationship. It was about modeling those school goals. It was about acting and speaking about what I said was important. If I said that showing respect to every single person in every interaction was what I wanted to see happen in our school, then I had to model it each and every time. Todd Whitaker, who has done some work in the United States, talks about building relationships. And one of the things that he said when I heard him speak that has always stuck with me is he said, when it comes to dealing with people, you are only as effective as your last interaction. And I thought how important that is, because that really is the impression you leave people with. Developing the organization towards desired outcomes is the third domain. And in this domain, I've shared two quotes. The first one, leaders think and talk about the solutions. Followers think and talk about the problems. Now, keeping in mind that every organization needs both. We need leaders and we need followers. But I think this is quite interesting because it's about, as the leader, thinking forward as towards solutions. It doesn't mean that we dismiss the problems. It doesn't mean that we do not talk about them. But our focus is around moving forward. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this when we talk about problem solving. Steve Jobs talks about innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower, which has direct connections to our topic for the conference. And when you think about that leader that is thinking positively, is thinking about the future, is thinking about the solutions, it simply opens the door for innovation to take place. So the leadership practices associated with this domain include distributing the leadership and facilitating collaboration. Collaboration being the opportunity for people to work together. We know that when people get together, it can be collegial or it can be collaborative. Collegial conversations, people are getting along, everyone is agreeing with each other. It's quite a happy time. But sometimes in that situation, gains aren't made. There are times for collegial conversations and there are times for collaborative conversations. Those being collaborative conversations where people work with each other, they challenge each other's thinking, they're moving forward on a certain focus. We are here to talk about this. We're here to talk about how do we better enable this group of students to learn. There can be discourse, there can be challenging, there will be times when people do not agree. That's where learning takes place. That's where change happens. So it's important that we have time for collaboration. And I would also say to you, collaboration can be a negative experience if people do not have the skills to collaborate. If you put a group together, it just doesn't happen naturally. If you have a group that you are trying to help focus on a project and it's not moving along, one of the things I would encourage you to do is to take a look at the skills of that group. Because in order to work together, they need to know how to disagree in an agreeable way. They need to know how to listen actively. They need to know how to be respectful of others' opinions. They need to know how to reach consensus. So those are all skills that people need in order to collaborate successfully. It's important to build those relationships with the school community and the wider community. And that, when we talk about the wider community and the parents and guardians, I think it's always important to remember that it needs to be a reciprocal relationship. It's not only about us inviting our families into our school and helping them to better understand the work, the tremendous work that you're doing in your school, but it's about us as leaders going out to the community and sharing with them. And of course, a healthy and safe school. The fourth component is improving the instructional program. And Stephen Covey, who I always enjoy his work around effective characteristics of highly effective people, his quote, "Effective leadership is putting first things first." And when we talk about improving the instructional program, that is one of the most important considerations. That student well-being and student achievement must be at the forefront of everything we do every single day. It is about providing instructional support. That support can look differently. It may be about knowledge, about pedagogy, about how children learn, and about how adults learn too, because as a leader we're working with adults too. It's about understanding the research and the effective practices that make a difference. It's about being knowledgeable about how to teach, about the instructional strategies that will in fact engage students and will increase student achievement. It's about the conditions that need to be present for instruction to take place. It's about place. It's about resources. It's about time. It's about all of those conditions that make learning an optimal learning environment. It's also about the regular monitoring of the learning and improvement. And that when we talk about monitoring, in my presentation I'm doing on Thursday, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, because that in itself could be a whole topic this afternoon. The fifth component is securing accountability. And Peter Drucker's quote, "Effective leadership is not about making speeches or being liked. It's about being defined by results, not attributes." This really speaks to the importance of accountability. And we know that the level of accountability has increased in Ontario over the last 15 years. And as I heard your minister speak today, I hear you're on the same path with that and have in fact several structures in place to support you. When we talk about accountability, I'd like to talk a little bit about internal accountability and external accountability. And I'm going to share a little story with you about my experience as a principal and something that I did that now that I know better, I wouldn't do again. Okay? So when we think about accountability, when new initiatives came into our school, there was sometimes a tendency, because people were busy, people had a lot to do, and we would be sharing out the information. And sometimes it might be that tendency to say, staff would say, well, why do we have to do this? We are so busy. We have so many things to do. And sometimes the tendency was, well, we have to do it because the district says so. Or we have to do it because the ministry says so. The fact was, they did say that. But as soon as I said that to my team, I had immediately given them the opportunity to opt out, to not do it, because I didn't think it was important. So when we talk about that being external accountability, internal accountability is what we have our goals in our school and what we do to stay the course on those goals. And in reading the research, a really interesting situation where, in fact, effective leaders are able to do the intersection of internal accountability and external accountability. And where they can find that point, that's when they're more effective. So now, as I was going into a school and sharing that, I would share about what our expectations were from our district and our ministry, and I would share how it fit into the work that we are already doing in our school goals. And so when you can, as a leader, see that intersection, that helps your team also understand that we are doing this not for other people, but we're doing it because we have already decided that that's important for our students to learn. So something to think about in that regard. One of the activities that I think is really important as a learner is we know that we don't learn by just listening, but we learn when we think about our learning, when we reflect on things. So I'd like you just to take a minute. You're just going to keep this to yourself. You're not going to share it. But we talked about those 5 domains. We talked about setting goals. We talked about building relationships and developing people. We talked about developing the organization. We talked about improving the instructional program. And we also talked about the importance of accountability. Think about you as a leader. What are your strengths? We aren't all strong in all of them. And there will be times when we feel stronger in others. But what are your areas of strength? What are your areas of growth? What resources do you have within your system to help you? So for instance, as we talked a little bit about setting goals, what resources do you have within your organization, and where can you go to get that assistance to help you grow in that area? And what will you do next with this information? Is it valuable information? If so, how will it change your focus when you leave here today? Or will it? When Ken Leithwood wrote the framework, the first framework had those 5 domains. And we knew that they were solid, they were based on research. But what we also knew was that there were people who had skill in all 5 domains. But some people were more successful than others. And why was this so? Well, during the time between the first framework and the second framework, additional research emerged around the importance of personal leadership resources. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into these that Amy and Joanne talked about this morning. We know that there are 3 types. There are cognitive resources, there are the social resources, and the psychological resources. The cognitive resources are those resources around knowing and being knowledgeable about learning, about teaching and learning, and about knowing the pedagogy, to know what works. It's about being able to have problem-solving expertise. And when we talk about problem-solving in this context, we're talking about knowing where we want to be and knowing where we are now. And how are we in fact going to move through that gap to in fact achieve the goal that we have set. The importance of cognitive resources, and the interesting thing about cognitive resources, it's both about knowledge and about those skills. When we take a look at the social resources, we talk about perceiving emotions, managing emotions, and acting in emotionally appropriate ways. And if you you would be familiar with the work of Daniel Goleman in emotional intelligence, and this ties into his work around emotional intelligence. It is about being able to recognize the emotions in myself and others, both verbally and non-verbally. To be able to anticipate, to be able to understand how people are feeling and why they are feeling that way. It's about managing the emotions. It's about, rather than reacting, it's about reflecting on it, understanding it, and then responding in an appropriate way. And it's also about acting in emotionally appropriate ways. Now, the interesting thing about the social resources is, as leaders, whether you're a teacher leader, aspiring teacher leader, school or system leader, as those leaders become better at those social resources, it's modeling it for their team. And they too will get better. They will get better at working with each other. They will get better in sometimes their dealings with parents. But you will see that that modeling will in fact help others to become better in that area. The psychological resources are 4: optimism, self-efficacy, resilience, and proactivity. The psychological resources were included because we know that leadership of schools and education is a complex situation. And it involves more than just knowing, and it involves more than how to do it. It's really about being able to enact these 4 components. We talked earlier about, in order to learn, we have to step out of our comfort zone. And as we step out of our comfort zone, it is so important for that leader and those people that are leading us to be hopeful, to be optimistic, to be solution focused. You know, there are times in all of our lives where we face more challenging times. And as the leader, we must step up and be hopeful. You know, a great quote that talks about, you know, anyone can lead in the good times. It's in the challenging times where the real leader emerges. And that real leader that can take a group through a challenging time, be hopeful towards a better outcome at the end. It's about self-efficacy. It's about believing we can do it. It's about helping your team believe they can do it. Believe they have the ability to achieve this. It's about individual self-efficacy, each person that you work with, but also collective, the whole team self-efficacy. Because we know that when we believe that we can do something, then we are willing to persevere, to keep at it, to be able to continue when the times get challenging. Because we believe that if we keep doing it, we will in fact achieve. It's also about resiliency. And if you think about resiliency as being the ability to face adversity, to face a challenging situation, to be able to work through it, to be able to bounce back. And the most important component, I believe, of resiliency is not only to bounce back, but be better for it. That in fact it has changed. It changes how you will approach it going forward. So if you think about all those situations, being optimistic, believing we can do it, persevering through the challenges, bouncing back and continuing forward, all those characteristics help leaders to lead others. The notion of proactivity is really about anticipating and also managing that change on a greater complex scale. Again, let's pause for a personal reflection. We talked about the cognitive resources, we talked about the social resources, we talked about the psychological resources. What areas are your strength? What areas do you think, I'd like to know a little bit more about that, or I'd like to learn a bit more about that? And where can you go for that support? We began this section of the presentation where I asked you to think about a leader and the two qualities. I hope that as I talked a little bit about some of those characteristics, did you hear me talking about some of the things that they did? Because I hope you did, that some of those skills that you identified, whether it was honesty, vision, sense of humor, but hopefully those qualities, I would say most often will align with that type of research on the 5 domains and the 3 personal leadership resources. So let's go back to our diagram. We began with self. We were taking a look at our own self. We're now going to move out and talk a little bit about those leadership practices that are school-wide and are based on the work of Vivian Robinson, Dr. Vivian Robinson from University of Auckland. And I have a video clip that I'd like to share with you. But first, let's read the quote. Leadership that makes a difference to the equity and excellence of student outcomes and is measured by the impact on the student rather than the impact on the adults.
The bottom line on what counts as effective leadership is, for our research team, the difference you make to the students. It might sound common sense, but it's quite radical, because school leaders are often judged on their relationships with the adults, their teachers, their parents, and not so much on the difference they make for the students. So this question about what specific leadership practices make a difference for students, we were asked to address that question at the University of Auckland by the Ministry of Education in New Zealand. So we discovered that there are 5 sets of leadership practices that make a difference to student outcomes. So the more of these leadership practices in the school, the better for the students. The first is clear goals, usually around learning or some aspect of student well-being. The second is, once you've got those goals, that you are resourcing the achievement of those goals through the way you use money, time, and teaching resources. The third is leadership that's deeply involved in the core business of teaching and learning, through getting involved with planning the curriculum, what's being taught, and how well it's being taught. The fourth is leadership that's actually involved with staff in learning how to achieve the goals, because quite often staff need to learn more about how to teach a particular group of students differently. So that leadership that's involved in teacher learning is a very powerful sort of leadership practice. And the last one is that this all sits on a foundation of both staff and students feeling they're working in a safe and orderly school environment. Everybody knows in their gut that leadership is important. We're much more focused on making a bigger difference for our students, making them more confident about their learning so that they can go on in their learning to university, to better jobs, to contribute to our society in positive ways.
So a powerful video where Dr. Robinson talks about the importance of students. And this really matches very clearly your message from your minister this morning where you talked about we need to focus on our students. She identifies 3 capabilities and the 5 dimensions that she mentioned. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about those. Now what you will find is that with good research you will see overlap. And you'll hear me saying and referring to some of the things that I already spoke to. Because that is validation that in fact this is important and it works. When she did her research, she did what she talks of best evidence synthesis. So she took a look at research across the world and came up with these particular aspects. In the 3 capabilities, she identifies 3: creating and mobilizing knowledge, relational trust, and solving complex problems. Well, we know when we talk about creating and mobilizing knowledge, it's about having current knowledge. It's about being knowledgeable about the pedagogy that is working, that we know works with our students. It is about being able to apply that knowledge and to be able to assess that knowledge. One of the components that she speaks about is classroom observations. And these classroom observations, she refers to them in 2 ways. Classroom observations that are done as a learning experience, that they are done frequently. Many times that it is about helping people to learn and to improve their practice. It can be with teachers visiting each other's teachers or classrooms. It can be about leaders visiting classrooms. But it is not only about appraisal. Now, during appraisal time, to give you an example, in my jurisdiction, in Ontario, principals will go into schools, into classrooms on a regular basis. They sometimes call it a 3-minute walkthrough. They just kind of walk through. It's very informal. The teacher keeps teaching, the students keep working, and it really is just about having a sense of the learning that's taking place. And then during appraisal time, there are more formal visits that are in fact conducted by the leader. But in those informal visits, there are some key components that can be observed. And as you're visiting classrooms, whether it be colleagues' classrooms or whether you're as a leader visiting classrooms, the 3-minute walkthrough research talks about 5 components to take a look at. So as I walk into a classroom, the first thing I want to look at is student engagement. Are students engaged in the lesson? Are all students engaged in the lesson? If I visit that classroom 5 times over the next 3 weeks, are the same students always engaged? And maybe is Joni always kind of fooling around in the classroom? So who's being, is everyone engaged in the learning? We want to understand the curriculum connections. As I visit those classrooms, can I see evidence of the curriculum being taught that is designated for that grade? I want to look at the instructional strategies. I want to take a look, how are students being taught? How are they learning? Are they learning individually? Are they learning in groups? Are they learning with iPads? Are they always learning the same way? Or are they learning in multiple ways? Is that particular environment tapping into all the different ways in which students learn? I want to look at student work. I may want to speak and talk to students, have them show me their work. I want to understand how they are learning and what they are learning. And as I talk to them about their learning, I'm helping them engage in metacognition to think about their learning. And that is a skill that's so powerful for all students. And I want to make sure that it is a healthy and safe environment. So just some things to think about as you think about your own classroom, but also as you visit classrooms. The second component is relational trust. And Vivian Robinson talks about the importance of trust in working and leading. And I'm going to share a video clip with you where she talks a little about the relationship of trust and doing the hard work.
Your research, Vivian, highlighted the need for school leaders to develop really strong and positive relationships with staff, relationships that are based on trust. Can you elaborate on that?
There's no point leaders sitting in their offices and setting goals if nobody else is committed to them. So it's in goal setting, it's in strategic resourcing, which is a source of considerable tension and distrust of leaders sometimes. It's in you can't be an instructional leader in the sense of leading the quality of teaching or ensuring the quality of teaching if you can't have conversations with teachers about the quality of teaching or the quality of their planning or the quality of their assessment or the quality of their reporting. So a lot of instructional leadership gets stuck on the inability to have those conversations. The change process gets stuck because the leader's right down the road and the staff are sort of dragging their feet way back there. So the relationships are critical. And for me, relationships, the challenge of relationships is not building relationships per se. Most leaders are pretty good at getting along with their staff. That's not the challenge. The challenge is how to integrate doing the important work with maintaining and building relationships. And people get into trouble when they separate the two out. And also for me, teaching about relationships separately from embedding relationship building in doing the important work is a waste of time.
Where does the notion of trust come in? And if trust is important, what do leaders do in order to trust it?
Yes, well, this is again where integrating the work with the relationship building is critical, because trust is a result. It is not a precursor. So sometimes leaders think, well, if I build trust and I get enough trust money in the bank, literally or figuratively, then I can tackle this difficult stuff. It doesn't work like that. Teachers trust leaders on the basis of their judgments, implicit judgments of daily interactions. They trust leaders on the basis of watching them do the work and how they treat people in doing the work. Teachers don't trust leaders who they don't perceive as competent. So look at that for the integration of work and relationships. Leaders who do not tackle the difficult stuff are not seen as competent. Those two things go together, and that reduces trust. Education is a team business. What I can do in my classroom is really dependent on what you've done with the same students the year before, what you're doing with them in terms of the norms and expectations you set really affects me. The risks I can take to try stuff out is going to depend on the way the leaders treat me if I fail. So it's a very risky team-built, team-based, interdependent business, and that demands trust. So leaders can do a lot to build trust because we know the determinants of trust: personal integrity, leadership competence, perceived competence, interpersonal competence, getting the work done in respectful ways. So we do a lot of work in the Centre for Educational Leadership that I lead in Auckland on the actual detail, the conversations of building trust. We call it open to learning conversations, and we teach people how to tackle tough stuff while building trust.
So in that video, she makes a couple of key points. She talks a little bit about the importance of the collective work, that we are all responsible for all our students. The work that we do is dependent on the people who have taught our students before and those that will teach after. She talks about the importance of building trust, and that trust is an outcome of doing the work. She talked about how important it is for the leaders to model that trust and to model doing the work and being competent in that area. So a couple of key points. She also talks about problem solving. So in terms of problem solving, here's a scenario. The students in your school are happy and the parents are very pleased. As a teacher leader or school leader or system leader, you are presented with some national data that indicates your students are lacking skills in numeracy. What do? Everyone's happy. There is no urgency on the part of your students or your parents, but as the leader, you know that you need to make a change. So a couple things to think about as you problem solve. It's about the notion of the solution focus. It's about staying positive. It's important to be able to identify, in this case, how numeracy is connected to your school goals. Although it may not at this point be perceived as an issue, you want to connect it to your school goals, because there you're now building internal accountability to make the change. We talked about clearly communicating your focus, being open to others, and to be able to understand and anticipate some of the challenges as you're moving through the problem. And of course, realizing that as a leader, we don't have all the skills. We always want to have a team that we can work collaboratively with to, in fact, achieve that. When we think about those capabilities, it's important to just take a bit of time to reflect. So which capabilities are currently strong within your work setting? Is it relational trust? Is it the notion of knowledge? Is it the notion of problem solving? Which are less evident? And is there one that you think warrants further looking at? It's interesting when we think about the problem solving and that ability of people to solve problems. When staff and people are asked about leaders and what it is that they believe makes them effective, one of the characteristics or traits that emerges is obviously competency, but also the ability to be able to problem solve issues fairly and in a timely manner. Other people see that as an indication of effective leadership. So we take a look at the 5 dimensions. I like to think about these 5 dimensions and predict which dimensions do you think have the most impact on student learning and achievement. Out of those 5. Here's the research. If you take a look at the effect size, and keep in mind that anything 0.2 or below is considered a weak impact. Anything above 0.6 as being high impact. You will see that out of those 5 dimensions that she spoke about, they are all in the moderate range, but dimension number 4, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, it has the most significant impact along the way. So dimension number 1, moderate impact, 0.42. We know it makes a difference. To quote one of our colleagues in Toronto, Michael Fullen talks a little bit about the moral purpose, about when we're setting goals, that it is in fact focused on the expectations and belief that every child can learn given the right amount of time and approach. When we are setting those goals and thinking about those goals, there are 3 C's to think about. The first C is that goals are clear and concise. That they are SMART goals. SMART being specific, measurable, attainable, results-driven, and timely. That the goals are based on data and that they are communicated. The second C is commitment. Commitment being that everyone is committed to work on the goal, that they understand it, that you have come to agreement as a group that it is an important goal, that it is a goal that we know will make a difference for our students, and that we can make linkages to the work that we're doing. And third C is capacity. This is an area where sometimes it can be easy to fall down. In that when we are talking about setting goals and working on goals, we are very often very good as educators in providing the knowledge to our team. But sometimes we neglect to spend a considerable amount of time on giving them the skills to in fact do it. That they may have the knowledge but perhaps do not have the skills to apply it. So the 3 C's around establishing goals and expectations. If I visited your school later this week, what would I see and hear in your school that would demonstrate that? People are setting and sharing the vision. People are using data and evidence to set the goals. That the staff or your team have the capacity and the skills and the knowledge to do it. And that your goals align with the national goals that your minister identified and spoke to you about this morning. The second dimension is strategic resourcing. Again, a moderate impact. This is about a process. It's about time, people, and money. It's about having the best people working with your most vulnerable students. It's about giving time for instruction and for preserving instructional time. Joanne gave the example this morning about announcements and how that time was set aside. That's about strategic resourcing. It's about prioritizing time for instruction. And last but not least, prioritizing money and resources for instruction. I remember visiting a school, and one of their goals was to increase literacy development in their primary division. And yet, most of their budget at that particular time was going towards buying outdoor play equipment for that division. That's a misalignment of resources. Your budget and how you spend your money needs to be reflective of your goals. So you want to be able to focus on the teaching and learning resources that are specific to the goals. You want to be able to include others in the decision making so that in fact there's consensus. And what the research is becoming more and more clear about is how important it is to work with other schools and other groups to be able to learn to share resources, to maximize resources, whether it be people, products, or time. Think about student achievement and well-being in your school. What are your goals? How is money spent? How are resources spent? Are your best teachers working with your most vulnerable students? Is the professional learning that your team is working on, is it connected to the goals that you have set? The third dimension, ensure quality teaching. Again, a moderate effect. Sonny Donaldson, who is a superintendent from the United States, talks about the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And it's really about keeping the focus on what is important. And we know that in fact, I think it was your minister spoke this morning about how you change, nothing's more important than the quality of your teachers in an organization. Everyone plays a role. When we talk about instruction, everyone in your organization has a role. And it's important that they can articulate it. We've talked about classroom observations. We've talked about the monitoring of student progress and the importance of learning leaders being open to learning and having that learning stance. To what extent is the teaching of, for example, literacy in your school? How is that connected across and within grade levels? How much student data are you collecting? And how does it impact instruction? And what are some of the barriers that perhaps teachers are experiencing that would help them use assessment and data for instructional purposes? Dimension 4, this is the highest impact, highest effect. For every increment of performance I require of you, I have a responsibility to provide you with the capacity to do it. An important message for leaders to remember. If I'm going to give you the task of improving student achievement and well-being in our school, I must give you the skills to do that. And I can do that in a couple of different ways. I can promote learning as a leader. I can provide opportunities for people to learn, multiple opportunities to visit other classrooms and schools. I also need to learn and be a learner with you as a leader. Michael Fullen does a lot of work around the learning leader and how important that is. If our goal is to increase numeracy for our third grade students, and I'm going to have some professional learning take place, as the leader, I need to sit with you and I need to learn with you. When I learn with you, there are many benefits. Not only do I gain more knowledge, but I now have a sense of the knowledge of my team. I also then have a better understanding of what the teachers, my team need in order to deliver on my task that I have given them. I understand better the challenges. I understand better their skills, and I know what success will look like. So by sitting and learning with my team, not only am I learning, but I am gaining very important knowledge that will help me support my team as they continue to learn. So the learning leader models the importance of being the learner. They engage in formal and informal discussion. The learning leader has informal conversations about teaching and learning with staff in the staff area, in the hall. That is just conversations that take place. And they participate in that learning. When we are working together as a collaborative learning culture, that's in fact when we achieve our utmost work. Because individually, we don't all have the skills. So when we work together, it is we mobilize the skills of every individual, and collectively, we are better. It helps to remind us that all students are everyone's responsibility. If I am a third grade teacher, I'm not just responsible for third grade students, I'm responsible for all the students in my school. Collaboration and that teamwork helps to understand diversity. Diversity of opinion, diversity of challenges, and to in fact help to use that diversity to make us stronger and to be able to build that coherence in our school. It helps us to all focus on those goals, and along the way we'll certainly create and build that efficacy, which we know is so important. The professional learning that takes place. Always important to keep in mind when we talk about professional learning, that professional learning, we always must be able to identify the student need. Our team is getting this professional learning to meet this student need and to be able to connect that. To be able to help understand how that in fact will improve the learning, and it might include some external expertise, but often there is great expertise within your team to build upon. As you think about your school, do leaders learn with staff? Do you talk about teaching and learning? In the hall? In conversations? Are there places for staff to get together and learn together? Is there a location? Is there resources? Are there opportunities? Do people have the skills for collaboration? I shared that with you earlier, but the skills need to happen. And when they collaborate, is it focused on student achievement and well-being? The last dimension is the orderly and supportive environment. And Vivian Robinson makes an interesting distinction here. She says, from the point of view of leadership actions, this dimension of leadership comes first. If students and staff do not feel physically and psychologically safe, then little progress is likely to occur. The dimension is discussed last when she talks about the 5 dimensions, because she believes that the knowledge leaders need to do this work is already embedded in the capabilities as well as in the previous dimensions. So when we think about the orderly and supportive environment, again, you'll see we hear the same themes coming forward, because that helps to support that it in fact make a difference. High expectations. Clear and concise behavior codes is very important when we talk about this. That the behavior codes are clear. Students know what to expect, parents know what to expect, staff know what to expect, and when issues arise, they are dealt with consistently and timely. That there is a plan for conflict resolution. That there is clear problem solving. All of these things help to create confidence in the leader and the environment for learning to take place. As you think about the 5 dimensions, is there a dimension that, as I spoke about it, you thought, we do a really good job in our school and our team on that? Were there any dimensions that you thought, that's something I'd like to know a little bit more about? Vivian Robinson's book on student-centered leadership is a great read if you're interested in learning more about her work. It delves deeper into all the aspects. It's an excellent resource, and certainly encourage you, if you're interested in more information, to access that. She talks about the fact that the leadership team is so important. The scope of the work is too great, the expertise required too broad, to reasonably expect any one person to do it all. It's about putting together your team and building those skills in your team that will help you as a team to move forward towards increasing student achievement and well-being for every student in your school. Back to where we started, we talked about the self, our own leadership practices. We talked about just Vivian Robinson's work, what are the practices within a school environment that will make a difference. And throughout that, we talked a little bit about how we engage our district and our community, how we go out to them and how we invite them in. As we close off, just a final reflection. I hope that today you will be able to take one action that you'll take away as a result of some of the information that I've shared with you today. Something that when you leave here today, you might want to read more about, or you might want to ask more questions about. I hope that there may be 2 concepts that you'll want to pursue further and do some reading, whether it be the framework or Vivian Robinson's work. And I hope you 3 ideas that you found that were interesting. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you. I wish you an enjoyable rest of the conference, and thank you so much.